Have you ever thought about why most success stories end in disaster? Why do people who achieve everything they wanted find themselves trapped by that very success? Why does the entrepreneur who builds a billion-dollar company end up losing it? Why does the revolutionary who wins the revolution get executed by his own followers? This video will change how you see success, planning, and the invisible endgames that determine whether your victories become prisons or platforms. Today we're diving into Law 29 from the 48 Laws of Power, plan all the way to the end. But this isn't just about being thorough or thinking ahead. This is about understanding one of the most catastrophic failures in human psychology, our complete inability to think beyond the moment of victory. We plan obsessively for success but never for what comes after success. We fight to reach the top but never consider what we'll do once we're there. We achieve our goals and discover too late that we never planned for the achievement itself. Let me tell you a story that will make everything clear. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood at the Rubicon River with his army. Roman law forbade any general from bringing troops into Italy proper. Crossing the Rubicon meant civil war. Caesar had planned this moment meticulously. He knew exactly how to mobilize his legions, which cities to secure, which senators to neutralize. He crossed the river, saying the famous words, "The die is cast," and began a civil war that he won completely within 4 years. By 45 BC, Caesar controlled Rome absolutely. He had defeated all rivals. The Senate was powerless. The people loved him. He had achieved total victory. And then, on March 15, 44 BC, less than a year after his final triumph, he was stabbed to death by senators he thought he had neutralized. 23 knife wounds. Dead on the Senate floor. All his victories meaningless because he failed to plan for what came after victory. Caesar's mistake wasn't tactical. He had brilliant military strategy. His mistake was existential. He planned how to win the civil war but not how to survive winning it. He thought that achieving power meant the game was over. He didn't understand that achieving power just meant entering a new, more dangerous game. He never planned for the endgame. So the endgame destroyed him. This pattern repeats throughout history with such consistency that it reveals a fundamental flaw in how humans think about goals and success. We are wired to focus on obstacles between us and our desires. We think obsessively about how to overcome those obstacles. But we think almost not at all about what happens after we overcome them. Victory becomes an end point in our imagination when in reality it's just a transition to new problems we never anticipated. Let me take you back 200,000 years to understand why we're built this way. Our ancestors lived in environments where goals were immediate and concrete. Find food today. Avoid that predator right now. Secure shelter before nightfall. These goals had natural endpoints. Once you caught the animal or found the cave, the problem was solved. There was no complex aftermath to manage. Natural selection optimized us for achieving immediate, concrete goals. It did not optimize us for managing the complex second and third order consequences of achieving abstract, long-term goals. When you're hunting a mammoth, you don't need to think about what happens after you've successfully killed it and eaten it and used its hide. The goal is the end point. But in modern life, almost no goals are real endpoints. They're transitions. Getting the job isn't the end point, it's the beginning of needing to perform in that job. Winning the election isn't the end point, it's the beginning of needing to govern. Building the company isn't the end point, it's the beginning of needing to run it. Getting married isn't the end point, it's the beginning of needing to maintain the marriage. Every achievement creates new challenges that most people never plan for because they were completely focused on the achievement itself. Your brain is running software designed for a world of immediate, concrete goals and a world of complex, cascading consequences. This mismatch explains why most victories turn into disasters. Not because people are stupid but because the human mind naturally thinks in terms of obstacles and achievements rather than systems and consequences. Now let me show you how this plays out in a case study that perfectly illustrates Law 29. In 1999, two pharmaceutical executives named Martin Shkreli and Retrofin founded a drug company. Their plan was brilliant in its simplicity: acquire the rights to drugs that had expired patents but high barriers to generic competition, then dramatically increase prices. The strategy worked perfectly. They acquired drugs, raised prices by thousands of %, made enormous profits. Shkreli became wealthy and famous. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve. But he had never planned for what came after achievement. He hadn't considered that extremely high prices on essential drugs would attract media attention. He hadn't considered that media attention would invite regulatory scrutiny. He hadn't considered that regulatory scrutiny would lead investigators to discover his history of securities fraud. He hadn't planned for success making him a target. By 2017, Shkreli was in prison. Not for the drug pricing that made him rich, but for previous frauds that investigators only discovered because his success made him visible. He planned how to make money. He executed that plan perfectly. But he never planned for what happens when you make money in ways that make you a symbol of everything people hate about pharmaceutical companies. The success itself created the conditions for his destruction. This is the essence of Law 29. The path to your goal is only half the story. The other half, often the more dangerous half, is what happens after you reach the goal. Most people never think about this second half. They assume that achieving the goal solves everything. Instead, achieving the goal often creates entirely new problems that destroy you unless you plan for them. Let me show you how this operates in entrepreneurship, because startups are perfect laboratories for watching Law 29 in action. Every entrepreneur has a vision: build a product, get users, raise money, grow the company. Most entrepreneurs plan obsessively for these milestones. They strategize about product market fit, user acquisition, pitch decks, growth metrics. Some succeed. They build products people want. They raise millions or billions in funding. They grow to hundreds or thousands of employees. And then they discover they never planned for managing a large organization. They never consider that the skills that make you good at starting companies are completely different from the skills needed to run companies. They never thought about the fact that rapid growth attracts competitors, regulators, media scrutiny, internal politics. They plan how to succeed but not how to manage success. So success destroys them. You see this pattern constantly. The founder who raises a massive round at a huge valuation, then discovers they've committed to growth targets they can't hit and given their investors expectations they can't meet. The CEO who scales to thousands of employees, then discovers they've created a culture they can't control and middle management layers that don't share their vision. The entrepreneur who goes public at billions in valuation, then discovers they're now subject to quarterly earnings pressure that forces short-term thinking incompatible with their long-term vision. In every case, the entrepreneur planned meticulously for achieving success but never for managing the consequences of that success. They thought IPO or unicorn valuation or market dominance was the endgame. They discovered too late that these achievements just moved them into a new game with different rules, different opponents, and different win conditions they never prepared for. Now here's where this gets really dark, and I need you to pay close attention because this is the twist that changes everything. The reason we don't plan all the way to the end isn't just cognitive limitation. It's motivational. If you really thought through all the implications and consequences of achieving your goals, you might not pursue them. The goal looks attractive precisely because you're not thinking about what comes after. Think about this carefully. The entrepreneur pursuing $1 billion valuation isn't thinking about the quarterly earnings calls, the investor pressure, the loss of control, the obligation to prioritize growth over mission, the personal life sacrifice to public company demands. If they fully consider these consequences, they might choose to keep their company smaller and maintain control. But then they wouldn't build a $1 billion company. The politician pursuing the presidency isn't thinking about the impossible demands, the constant attacks, the no-win decisions, the way the office ages you decades and years, the way your entire life becomes public property. If they fully consider these consequences, they might not run. But then they wouldn't become president. This creates a paradox. Planning all the way to the end often reveals that the goal isn't actually desirable. But not planning all the way to the end means achieving goals that destroy you. You're trapped between paralysis through excessive planning and destruction through inadequate planning. There's no comfortable resolution to this paradox. What sophisticated operators do is plan all the way to the end while maintaining motivation to pursue the goal. They see the full picture, including the ugly parts, and they plan specifically for managing those ugly parts. They don't let the full picture paralyze them, but they also don't let optimism blind them. This is extraordinarily difficult. It requires holding two contradictory mental states simultaneously, complete clarity about consequences and unwavering commitment to action. Let me give you a historical example that shows both sides of this. In the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte was planning his invasion of Russia. His generals warned him about the vast distances, the harsh winter, the difficulty of supplying an army so far from France. Napoleon dismissed these concerns. He was focused on victory, on defeating Russia, on securing his empire's eastern border. He planned the invasion meticulously but only up to the point of military victory. He never planned for what happens when you conquer a country that refuses to surrender, that burns its own capital rather than let you occupy it, that forces you to maintain supply lines across thousands of miles as winter approaches. The invasion began in June 1812 with over 600,000 soldiers. It ended in December with perhaps 30,000 survivors. Napoleon's army was destroyed not by Russian military superiority but by consequences he never planned for. He planned how to invade Russia. He never planned for what happens when you succeed at invading a country prepared to destroy itself rather than submit. The lack of endgame planning turned his greatest military effort into catastrophic defeat. Contrast this with Otto von Bismarck, who unified Germany in the 1860s and 70s. Bismarck didn't just plan how to win the wars that would create Germany. He planned what the post-war order would look like, how to prevent the defeated from seeking revenge, how to balance power between the new Germany and its neighbors, how to transition from revolutionary to status quo power. He planned the endgame before starting the game. This allowed him to build something that lasted decades rather than collapsing immediately like Napoleon's empire. The difference wasn't intelligence or resources. It was that Bismarck understood Law 29 and Napoleon didn't. Bismarck knew that victory creates its own problems and planned for those problems in advance. Napoleon assumed victory solved problems and discovered too late that it created worse ones. Now let me show you how this law operates in everyday life. Because if you think this is just about historical figures and major entrepreneurs, you're missing how endgame blindness shapes every significant decision you make. Think about career planning. Most people plan obsessively about getting the job, getting the promotion, getting the raise. They research companies, practice interviews, build skills, network strategically. Some succeed. They get the impressive title at the prestigious company with the high salary. And then they discover they never planned for what that job would actually require day to day, what the culture would feel like, what the politics would demand, whether they'd actually enjoy the work or just enjoyed pursuing it. You see this constantly. People who fight for years to become partners at law firms, then discover partnership means even more hours and different pressures they hate. People who pursue medical careers for status and income, then discover they despise the actual daily work of medicine. People who aim for executive positions, then discover they're miserable with the responsibility and visibility and political maneuvering those positions require. They plan how to achieve the position. They never plan for what it would feel like to occupy that position. So achievement brings misery instead of satisfaction. They're trapped in victories they work years to achieve because they never thought past the moment of achievement. Or consider relationships. People plan obsessively about finding a partner, attracting them, winning them over. They think strategically about dates, presentation, what to say and do. Some succeed. They get the relationship. They get married. And then they discover they never planned for what marriage actually requires: daily compromise, conflict resolution, maintaining attraction over decades, navigating family relationships, managing finances together, raising children if they have them. The relationship that seemed perfect during the pursuit phase becomes difficult during the maintenance phase. Not because they chose wrong but because they planned for winning the relationship without planning for sustaining it. They thought getting married was the endgame. They discovered marriage is just the beginning of a completely different game they never prepared for. This pattern is universal. We plan for achievement without planning for aftermath. We think about obstacles without thinking about consequences. We focus on getting what we want without considering what we'll do once we have it. This is why most people's greatest successes become their greatest problems. Now let me show you the specific failure modes that happen when you don't plan all the way to the end. There are 5 common disasters that strike people who achieve goals without planning for what comes after. First is the success trap. You achieve something that requires you to keep achieving it or lose everything. The entrepreneur who raises money at a high valuation must now justify that valuation through growth. The athlete who wins a championship must now defend it. The politician who wins on promises must now deliver on them. The success created obligations you can't escape. You're trapped on a treadmill where stopping means losing everything. You never planned for the fact that success wouldn't be an endpoint but a new set of demands. Second is the target acquisition. Success makes you visible. Visibility attracts enemies, competitors, regulators, critics. The person who quietly made money was ignored. The person who publicly made millions becomes a target. The company that dominated a small market was left alone. The company that threatens to dominate a large market faces antitrust scrutiny. You plan for success but not for the attention success brings. So the attention destroys what you built. Third is the capability mismatch. You develop skills for achieving the goal but discover those skills don't transfer to maintaining the achievement. The founder who's brilliant at building products discovers they're terrible at managing organizations. The salesperson who's amazing at closing deals discovers they're awful at leading sales teams. The individual contributor who's excellent at technical work discovers they hate management. You plan to reach a position but not to function effectively in that position. Fourth is the meaning vacuum. You defined yourself entirely by pursuit of the goal. Once achieved, you have no idea who you are or what to do. The student who spent their entire identity on getting into Harvard has an identity crisis once they're there. The entrepreneur who built their entire self-concept around building a company feels empty once it's successful and running without them. The athlete who was only an athlete has no identity after retirement. You plan to achieve but not to exist as someone who has achieved. Fifth is the consequence cascade. You achieve the goal but trigger chain reactions you never anticipated. The politician who wins an election by making radical promises must now either break the promises and lose credibility or keep them and create instability. The company that disrupts an industry triggers defensive responses from incumbents, regulatory backlash, and cultural resistance they never prepared for. The person who gets revenge discovers it creates new enemies and new cycles of retaliation. Every action has reactions, and reactions have reactions, but you only plan for the first action. These 5 failure modes account for most of the disasters that strike successful people. Not because they failed to achieve their goals. Because they failed to plan beyond achievement. They never asked, what happens after I succeed? What new problems will success create? What skills will I need to manage success versus achieve it? Who will success make me into? What chain reactions will success trigger? Let me show you how to actually implement Law 29, because understanding the principle isn't enough. You need specific practices for planning all the way to the end. First practice, reverse engineering from the end state. Don't start planning from where you are now. Start from where you want to end up and work backwards. If you want to build $1 billion company, don't ask how to get there. Ask, what does life look like as CEO of $1 billion company? What demands does that role make? What skills does it require? What sacrifices does it demand? What enemies does it create? Then ask, do I actually want that life, or do I just want the idea of it? This reverse engineering often reveals that your goal, fully understood, isn't actually desirable. That's valuable information. Better to discover this during planning than after achievement. Sometimes you adjust the goal. Sometimes you prepare specifically for the challenging aspects. Sometimes you decide to pursue a different goal entirely. But you only get this clarity by starting from the end and working backwards. Second practice, scenario planning for success. Most people only plan for what happens if they fail. They worry about downside protection, backup plans, safety nets. Sophisticated operators also plan for what happens if they succeed. They ask, if everything works perfectly, what problems does that create? If we get all the users we want, how will we handle the server load? If we raise money at the valuation we're seeking, what growth expectations does that create? If we win the market share we're pursuing, what competitive responses will that trigger? Planning for success sounds weird because success is supposed to be the solution, not a problem. But success creates problems. Different problems than failure, but often more complex ones. The person who plans only for failure stays safe but small. The person who plans for success can scale without destroying what they built. Third practice, identify capability requirements at each stage. Don't just plan what you'll do, plan who you'll need to be. The skills that get you to seed stage are different from skills needed at Series A, which are different from Series B, which are different from IPO. The capabilities that make you a good individual contributor are different from those needed to manage a team, which are different from leading a department, which are different from running a division. Map out not just the milestones but the capability transitions between milestones. Then ask, can I develop these capabilities? Do I want to develop them? Or should I bring in people who already have them? This planning prevents the capability mismatch disaster where you achieve something you're not equipped to manage. Fourth practice, build exit options. Plan all the way to the end, but also plan exits at multiple points along the way. Don't lock yourself into a path that you can only complete or fail at. Create decision points where you can change direction, sell, step back, or pivot. The entrepreneur who raises money with terms that prevent exit becomes trapped. The professional who takes a job with golden handcuffs loses options. The person who makes public commitments they can't gracefully withdraw from is stuck on a path regardless of whether it still serves them. Smart operators maintain optionality. They achieve milestones but preserve the ability to stop, change direction, or exit if the next milestone stops being desirable. This requires planning for exits, not just for achievements. How do I get out if this stops serving me? What needs to be true for me to exit gracefully? Who needs to be positioned to take over if I step back? Fifth practice, stress test the endgame. Take your imagined end state and attack it intellectually. What could go wrong? Who would oppose this? What unintended consequences might this create? What would someone trying to destroy this achievement target? This isn't pessimism, it's preparation. You're identifying vulnerabilities before you're in the vulnerable position. You're planning defenses before you need them. This stress testing often reveals that your planned endgame is unstable or unsustainable. Good. Better to know that during planning than after investing years in achieving it. You can then adjust the plan to create a more stable endgame or accept that you're pursuing something inherently temporary and plan accordingly. These 5 practices transform planning from naive optimism to sophisticated strategy. You're not just asking how to achieve your goals. You're asking whether those goals, fully understood and fully achieved, actually serve you. You're planning not just for the journey but for the destination and what happens after you reach it. Now let me take you into the psychology of why this is so difficult. Planning all the way to the end requires thinking about outcomes that feel abstract and distant. Achieving the goal requires focusing on actions that are immediate and concrete. These two cognitive modes conflict. The mind that can envision distant consequences tends to be cautious about near-term action. The mind that can execute bold action tends to dismiss distant consequences as speculation. This is why people who are great at execution often fail at endgame planning, and people who are great at endgame planning often fail at execution. The mental states are almost contradictory. Execution requires narrowing focus to immediate obstacles and pushing through doubt. Strategic planning requires expanding focus to distant implications and honoring doubt about whether actions will produce desired outcomes. Mastering Law 29 means developing the ability to switch between these modes. You need execution mode to make progress. You need strategic mode to ensure progress is towards something sustainable. Most people get stuck in one mode or the other. The chronic planner never executes. The chronic executor never plans beyond the next milestone. The sophisticated operator toggles between modes. They use strategic planning mode to set direction and identify pitfalls. Then they switch to execution mode to make rapid progress. Then they periodically return to strategic mode to reassess whether the direction still makes sense given new information. This toggling is cognitively demanding but essential for sustainable success. Let me show you how this plays out in a detailed case study. In 2004, Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook from his Harvard dorm room. Unlike most college projects, Facebook grew explosively. Within months, it had users at dozens of universities. Within a year, it had millions of users. Venture capitalists offered huge investments. This is where most founders fail Law 29. They take the money, scale rapidly, then discover they've lost control of what they built. Zuckerberg did something different. He planned the endgame before accepting the money. He structured his funding to maintain absolute voting control. He ensured no investor could override his decisions. He set up the company so that even after going public, he would retain control through special share classes. This planning was controversial. Investors hated it. Many refused to invest on these terms. But Zuckerberg held firm because he had planned all the way to the end. The result? 2 decades later, Zuckerberg still controls Facebook, now Meta, despite owning only a minority of shares. He can make long-term decisions without being held hostage to quarterly earnings pressure. He survived scandals that would have gotten most CEOs fired because he structured things so he can't be fired. He planned for an endgame where he maintains control, then built that endgame into the foundation of the company before it became successful. This is sophisticated application of Law 29. Zuckerberg didn't just plan how to make Facebook successful. He planned how to remain in control of Facebook after it became successful. He anticipated that success would attract investors who would try to control him. He planned defenses against that scenario before the scenario emerged. The planning happened at the beginning but was oriented toward the endgame. Compare this to the founders of Twitter. They built a wildly successful platform but never planned for maintaining control of it. Investors and board members pushed out multiple founders. The company lurched from one CEO to another. Strategic direction changed constantly based on who had power in any given moment. Eventually, the company was sold to Elon Musk, and the founders had no ability to prevent it because they never planned for an endgame where they would need defensive structures. Same industry, similar success levels, completely different outcomes. The difference was planning. Zuckerberg planned all the way to the end before starting. Twitter's founders planned for growth but not for who would control that growth. One maintained control of their creation. The others lost it. Law 29 in action. Now let me show you how this law operates in military strategy, because warfare is where failure to plan endgames produces the most visible disasters. Every military strategist knows you must plan how to win battles. What separates great strategists from mediocre ones is planning for what happens after you win. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 is a perfect case study. The military planned meticulously for defeating Saddam Hussein's army. They had detailed strategies for air superiority, ground invasion, securing key cities. The military operation succeeded perfectly. Saddam's government fell within weeks. Then everything collapsed because no one had planned for what comes after you topple a government. There was no plan for maintaining order. No plan for preventing sectarian violence. No plan for rebuilding institutions. No plan for managing occupation of a hostile country. No plan for eventual exit. The military planned brilliantly for winning the war but not at all for what happens after winning. The result was years of insurgency, hundreds of thousands of deaths, trillions of dollars spent, and eventual withdrawal without achieving any strategic objectives. This wasn't stupidity. It was failure to apply Law 29. The planners focused entirely on the obstacle, Saddam's military. They never seriously planned for the aftermath, governing Iraq. They assumed that winning would solve problems. Instead, winning created worse problems because the endgame was never planned. Contrast this with the Marshall Plan after World War II. The Allies didn't just plan to defeat Germany and Japan. They planned for rebuilding them, for preventing the economic chaos that led to World War I, for creating stable democracies that wouldn't seek revenge. This endgame planning was expensive and controversial. Many Americans opposed spending billions to rebuild countries they'd just defeated. But the planning created stable allies and prevented the cycle of revenge that had caused 2 world wars in 30 years. Same basic situation, winning a war. Completely different outcomes based on whether planners thought beyond military victory to the political, economic, and social aftermath. The first case planned only for victory. The second planned all the way through victory to stable peace. The difference was Law 29. Let me take you into how this law operates in personal relationships, because this is where most people experience its consequences most painfully. People plan obsessively for getting into relationships but barely at all for maintaining them or exiting them gracefully if they stop working. Think about how much time and energy people spend pursuing relationships. Learning to be attractive, interesting, successful. Crafting dating profiles, going on dates, strategizing about how to progress from dating to commitment. Massive planning and effort goes into achieving the relationship. Then the relationship begins and people discover they never planned for the actual challenges of partnership. How do we handle conflict? What happens when attraction fades? How do we manage different values about money, children, lifestyle? What if one person's career demands moving but the other can't or won't? What if we grow in incompatible directions? None of this was planned for because all the planning was about getting the relationship, not sustaining it. The result is that most relationships fail not because people chose wrong partners but because they never planned for the reality of partnership. They planned for romance but not for compatibility. They planned for chemistry but not for conflict resolution. They planned for the beginning but not for the middle or the end. Sophisticated people plan differently. Before committing deeply, they discuss and plan for likely sources of conflict. Money, career, family, lifestyle, children, retirement. They establish processes for handling disagreement before disagreements emerge. They plan exit options if the relationship stops serving both people. This planning feels unromantic, but it's what allows relationships to survive beyond the initial romantic phase. The same principle applies to ending relationships. Most people never plan for how to exit gracefully if things don't work. So when relationships end, they end badly. Messy breakups, expensive divorces, ongoing conflict over children or property. All of this could be minimized by planning exit options before you need them. But most people can't do this because planning for relationship failure while pursuing relationship success feels contradictory. It's not contradictory. It's mature. Planning exit options doesn't make failure more likely. It makes failure less destructive if it happens. Prenuptial agreements, for example, are basically endgame planning for relationships. They specify what happens if the marriage ends. Most people refuse to do them because they feel like planning for failure. Actually, they're acknowledging that failure is possible and planning to handle it gracefully rather than catastrophically. This is true wisdom. Plan for the endgame you hope doesn't happen so that if it does happen, it doesn't destroy you. Hope for the best. Plan for the worst. Execute for the middle. That's how you survive scenarios you didn't anticipate. Now let me address the most common objection to Law 29. Doesn't planning for all contingencies lead to paralysis? If you really try to think through every possible outcome and consequence, you'll never act because you'll always see new problems. This objection is valid. Excessive planning does create paralysis. The art is knowing how much planning is enough. The answer is to plan decision points, not every action. You don't need to know exactly what you'll do in every situation. You need to know what decision points you'll face and what criteria you'll use to make decisions at those points. You need to know what information you'll need to gather and when. You need to know what would cause you to change direction and what that change would look like. This kind of planning provides structure without rigidity. You have a map of the territory but flexibility about the specific path through it. You know where you're going and what landmarks to watch for, but you can adjust your route based on conditions you encounter. Think of it like chess. Grandmasters don't plan every move to the end of the game. That's impossible because the possibility tree explodes too quickly. What they do is plan several moves ahead while understanding typical endgame patterns. They know if they can reach certain positions, they have winning strategies. They plan toward achieving favorable positions while remaining flexible about the specific moves that get them there. This is what planning all the way to the end actually means. Not scripting every action but understanding the likely endgames, knowing which endgames favor you, and maintaining awareness of whether you're moving toward favorable endgames or unfavorable ones. It's strategic framework, not tactical script. Let me show you one final case study that brings everything together. In 1997, a woman named Sarah Blakely had an idea for footless pantyhose. She spent 2 years developing the product while working a day job. She invested her $5,000 in savings. She filed patents herself to save money on lawyers. She managed to get her product into major retailers. Within a few years, Spanx was generating tens of millions in revenue. Within a decade, she was a billionaire. But here's what makes this relevant to Law 29. Blakely planned the entire journey before starting. She decided she would never take outside investment because she'd seen founders lose control of their companies. She planned to maintain complete ownership. She planned to grow slowly enough that she never needed outside capital. She planned to avoid the pressure of investors pushing for exits or IPOs. She planned to keep the company private so she could make long-term decisions without quarterly earnings pressure. 25 years later, Spanx is still private, still majority-owned by Blakely, still operating according to her vision. She built a multi-billion-dollar company without losing control, without facing investor pressure, without being forced into decisions that served others instead of her vision. She achieved this because she planned the endgame before starting the journey. Most entrepreneurs would have taken investment early, grown faster, lost control, been forced to sell or go public, and ultimately ended up as employees in companies they founded. Blakely avoided this by planning all the way to the end before taking the first step. She knew where she wanted to end up and structured everything from the beginning to make that endgame achievable. This is mastery of Law 29. Not just achieving success but achieving success on your terms because you planned what success would look like before pursuing it. Not just reaching the goal but reaching it in a way that you can sustain and enjoy because you planned for the aftermath of achievement. So as we close this exploration of Law 29, I want to leave you with these final questions. What goals are you currently pursuing? Have you planned all the way to the end, or just to the moment of achievement? What happens the day after you achieve what you're working toward? What new problems will success create? What capabilities will you need to manage success that differ from capabilities needed to achieve it? And more fundamentally, do you actually want the endgame you're pursuing, or just the idea of it? If you really understood what life looks like after achieving your goal, with all the demands and constraints and consequences, would you still want it? Or would you adjust your goal to something more sustainable? These questions are uncomfortable because they might reveal that you're pursuing something that won't actually serve you. But discovering that during planning is a gift. It lets you adjust course before investing years in the wrong direction. It lets you succeed on your terms instead of discovering too late that success on conventional terms is a trap. Plan all the way to the end. Not just to victory but through victory to the aftermath. Not just to achievement but to sustainable maintenance of what you achieve. Not just to success but to success you can actually live with. Most people achieve their goals and discover too late that they achieved the wrong goals, or that achievement created problems worse than what they started with. Don't be most people. Think beyond the obstacle. Think beyond the achievement. Think beyond the victory. Think all the way to the endgame. Then plan how to reach an endgame that actually serves you rather than destroys you. That's Law 29. That's how you avoid becoming another cautionary tale of someone who succeeded their way into disaster. That's how you build something that lasts instead of something that collapses the moment you achieve it. That's everything.